Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon in the meantime. We're back for the presentation of two gentlemen, Carsten Kratz and Patrick Funcke. Patrick is the founding partner of Evolutionizer, and Carsten Kratz has a background in the Boston Consulting Group, where he worked and is currently partner head of the DACH region at Bridgepoint. And they will entertain and inspire us on the topic of strategy management, strategy execution, and they will focus on the one hand on the potential tool sets that there are available. So what are the benefits of a single platform, and how can you, using a tool set, dynamically manage your strategy? And also they will talk to us about volatility. What is it? And also maybe take away some of the misunderstandings that there are about the terminology volatility. And the concept that I liked a lot is that they will talk about the concept of really small changes that they can have a big impact over time, which you not always see on the short term, but that become visible on the longer term. So Carsten and Patrick, it's up to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon. My name is Patrick Funcke. Just for the time frame, we believe that we have a presentation of about 20 minutes. So we'll then open up for questions afterwards, and we'll try to actually keep within those 20 minutes. Now, Laurent Jan was kind enough to introduce us both, but just one word about Evolutionizer. Evolutionizer is a European software and solution company. And our sole purpose is to provide a digital platform for an end-to-end strategy development and execution approach. And now, when we look at why we actually exist, most of us that are at Evolutionizer have a background in strategy development and strategy execution, a lot of it in consulting, but also in industry-leading roles. And what we found is that up till today, strategy development and execution are mostly done with insufficient tools. And by that, I mean that 99% of strategic planning and strategy development is based on Excel, on PowerPoint, sometimes on some specialized tools, in particular in strategy execution. Often tools from project management and portfolio management are used for strategy execution also, but none of them has the approach of being a total solution for enterprise development. And by that, we see several disadvantages. The first is what we call the strategic opportunity and execution gap. Now, the strategy execution gap is probably the more well-known, which is basically the difference between your strategic plan and what your organization actually manages to achieve. The other, the strategic opportunity gap, is probably even the bigger gap, and that is missing opportunities and missing risks and changes in the world that are relevant to you and not acting in time on them. The second disadvantage of an insufficient tool set is the breaking distance. Oftentimes, if you set strategic targets, you'll only see that you missed these targets after the next round of financial consolidation, while in reality, the information of how are you doing about strategy execution would have been available in the organization. Then today, the resources working on strategy execution, in particular on the aggregating level, have a lot of manual labor to find information, consolidate, aggregate it, visualize it, etc. And that's something that's no longer timely, that can be automated to a high degree. And last but not least, the way we do strategy today, we don't have structured data sets about what were our strategic assumptions, what were the strategic plans, and what did we execute against that, so we can use modern analytical methods such as advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. And now the first thing we would like to talk about is the perception of volatility. And that's where Carsten comes in, who is one of the best strategists I've ever met, and has a lot of heritage and a lot of experience with thinking long-term, thinking about short-term volatility versus long-term implications. So Carsten, please.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And let me start with sharing a small story. So 18 months back, just before COVID, I joined probably one of the last fundraising events It was a well-known institution here in Frankfurt. It's called Senckenberg. It's a research institute. It's about biodiversity loss. It's about climate change, etc. And on those kind of fundraising events, they clearly try to kind of get the message across in a very easy but still kind of interesting, fascinating way. So they had a tower being made up of many wooden pieces They had invited some children to this event, and children started to pull off these wooden pieces out of the tower. And they went on pulling, nothing changed. And then obviously you can imagine all of a sudden the whole tower imploded, collapsed. So that's typical for complex systems. You can do a lot with those systems, but that's, at some point there comes what's called a tipping point, and all of a sudden then everything changes. And obviously, as you can imagine, I mean, the more volatility you have in the system, the more likely you get to such a tipping point. I mean, we all observe these kind of these things in nature. Yeah? I mean, think about how heavy winds come in over the last decades, heavy rain, heavy snowfall. I mean, all what has come about with climate change. And I think what you can observe in nature, it's pretty simple in business. Business at the end of the day is also a very complex system. We observe many drivers of volatility, and I'm not saying we are coming to a total tipping point, but clearly we think about strategy probably needs to be rethought in such an environment. And if we move on to the next slide, I mean, we have a few examples of kind of where these volatility come from, and clearly politics is one. I mean, think 30 years back, that's when I started to work. I mean, the world was pretty simple. Yeah, you had the East and you had the West. China was basically not playing a role, and you had a pretty stable political environment which you could base your strategies on. And don't need to tell you this has changed dramatically over the last 2 or 3 decades. And clearly, with globalization, I mean, obviously the complexity has increased, and we see a lot of more volatility. And this also translates directly into economics. I mean, we have several examples on the next slide, but I mean, one simple example, or a very nice example actually, is think of pharma industry. I mean, we had the discussion around pharma or the presentation of pharma just before ours. But think about pharma manufacturing. 20, 30 years back, pharma manufacturing used to be pretty local. Then with globalization, a lot of pharma manufacturing has moved to India and China over the last decades. Now with COVID, with supply chains falling apart, with kind of local decisions to keep pharma in the country, India, China. I mean, we have a huge debate at the moment. We need to bring manufacturing back to Europe and to the Western world. We'll see, I mean, what's going to happen in 6 to 12 months. I mean, if we then realize that the cost of manufacturing is higher here as compared to India and China. So there's a lot of economical volatility, to some extent driven by politics, but also beyond that. Clearly, another dimension is the whole social part, I mean, I don't need to tell you how difficult it is to kind of to get talent. The short of a talent, you probably experience it each and every day in your organizations. And it's more challenging to attract talent. I mean, when I started to work 30 years, it was very much about the size of the company car that could make a difference. I mean, these kind of simple incentive schemes are over. You get the question around purpose, and I mean, as you may know, I've been many years with BCG, and we were very much a purpose driven company. Kind of the purpose we articulate was kind of unlocking the potential of those who want to advance the world, and this clearly was an extremely kind of attractive, or this is an attractive proposition. But then you hire the young people and then you staff them on a re-engineering case, and then you immediately get into discussion. So is this in line with our purpose? And then you say, well, but it's also part of our business, etc. So the social side will drive with volatility for sure in terms of your talent base. And the next one, clearly, where we could probably spend days and hours on, is the whole technological part. Just one thought on that one. I mean, we are basically in a data-driven world. We probably all agree on that. That means in practical terms, and the numbers from the various institutes change a little bit, but roughly we double the amount of captured data every year. Very much driven by kind of voice recognition, image recognition, so technologies which have dramatically enhanced the speed of data capture. But probably less than 1% of the overall captured amount is somehow meaningfully read or kind of processed. And think about the potential of artificial intelligence. So I think I don't need to spend too much time in showing or in convincing you that technology also will very much drive volatility and make these kind of the complex system we are more difficult to predict. And let me just pick a very second last one, which is the environmental side of things. I think there is no alternative. We will need to find answers to kind of the way we treat our system Earth. There will be changes around CO2, and also on that side, you can observe that at some points, I mean, there is many years of debate, but then all of a sudden things move and change. And at the moment, luckily, I'd say we probably are in a phase where, again, getting much more serious on the whole question of CO2, and again, that will drive a volatility and will change the boundary conditions you're working in. And let me pick a last one just to close on this volatility. It's obviously the legal side, and also that one will have some very difficult to anticipate implications. Think of autonomous cars. So basically, at the dealer, two cars leave the dealer. One turns left, one turns right. And if it's an autonomous car, if it's about adaptive learning, if it's about artificial intelligence, 2 minutes after leaving the dealer, they are technically in a different status. So, I mean, who is going to be in charge of that in future? Who is going to be made accountable for these things? So there will be a lot of also volatility on the legal side. But so I think you're probably experiencing that. Whether you are now in a multinational organization or whether you are in a medium-sized company, I'm sure you're operating in many countries. You typically have different business units, and in this complex system, you still need to come to some sort of a strategic plan. You need to break that plan into single actions and measures, and you need to track the execution of it. And this in this kind of big volatility. So probably the typical approach we used to work with over many decades with PowerPoint, Excel, etc., is probably not the smartest way to take it from here. And so let me go back to my nature example. I mean, already Darwin many decades back said it's about mutation, selection, and adaptation. So the question is, I think, how can we most successfully adapt to such a volatile world, and how can we be successful to in strategy for our complex systems, our organization in such a volatile world? And let me hand it back over to Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Now, with the explanation of what volatility actually can mean, actually in the long term, things that look like short term or look tangential to your business can all of a sudden become determining for your business. That means that a situation that is already problematic, an estimated strategy execution gap of 70% can even become bigger, at least if we don't change the methods and the tools that we apply. And now what we found is, we've been working on this for a couple of years now, there are a couple of things that we need to tackle volatility in the future. The first and probably most important is to not look at strategy execution and strategy development as distinguished and disconnected tasks. You actually have to look at it as an end-to-end process and a continuous process. By that I mean, you can't just decide on a strategy and then execute it blindly. You have to be in touch with what were your assumptions in the strategy, and you have to see whether those are changing or not and adopt your strategy. The second part that we find very important is to leverage every piece of intelligence that's available to you. It used to be that there was a great man theory and somebody developed a great strategy and executed against it, and there are still some examples of that being successful, but it's not the norm. You actually have within your employee base, within your customers, within your suppliers, there's a lot of information that can and should be leveraged, and that's very difficult to do manually, but it's a lot more feasible to do it with digital tools. And that also means, the distinction between top-down strategy, bottom-up strategy. The answer to that endless discussion is yes. You usually need both. And you should be merging those two. So you need the information out of your organization, out of the crowd, but you also need a top-down perspective because the organization itself will not get the big ideas of basically changing their own raison d'etre. So you need to combine these two. The next thing you need, if we all agree that volatility and long-term implications are getting shorter and shorter, that means you need short adoption loops. You need to basically, instead of executing or taking a year to develop a strategy and then executing it for 2 years, you need a staggered approach where you say you have long-term targets, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, and we have issues that we do against those. But we also have shorter-term targets, and even the long-term targets have to be reassessed very frequently in shorter loops, quarterly. And last but not least, as is typically the case when complexity grows, or even just complication grows, technology is the answer. Technology has a potential to do things 10 times faster, 20 times faster, 100 times faster, basically orders of magnitude. While just better methods maybe have an effectiveness factor of 2 or 3. If you're really, really good but still doing things manually, you won't be as successful as somebody who's just average but leveraging technology. And when it comes to technology, of course, we have an idea being in the realm of what is really important. When you select your toolkit for strategy development and strategy execution, what are the key success factors? The first is true born-in-the-cloud applications. And by that I mean not older legacy applications that have been moved to the cloud, but applications that have been built for the cloud, just have a significantly faster development speed, oftentimes order of magnitude faster. The way that an Amazon, a Facebook, or other applications that are born in the cloud develop continuously and always have the newest version available for each user is just significantly more powerful than any older technology, any legacy technology. Again, it's not just about providing it from the cloud, it's being built in the cloud, which implies that you only have one code base, you don't have different versions in the field, everybody is working on the latest version all the time. The second is integration. If you do strategy execution and strategy development, you will have certain areas where certain tools are already very popular. In particular, the collaboration tools such as Microsoft Teams or Slack previously. Those are favorite toys of the people working with them. They're very popular. And it makes no sense to say, well, please ignore them for what we're doing now when it comes to strategy and strategy development. The same when it comes to project management. There are certain strategic project types, such as in product development, who often already have a toolkit, such as Jira, or when it's more complex products, Siemens Center, product lifecycle management, etc. It makes no sense to duplicate the work that is done in there, and even less sense to ask people to no longer use their specialized tools. it makes sense to integrate them. So the application should be able to bring everything that you need to the table, but also adapt to wherever the tools are already in use. Then there is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is simply a huge technological potential, and you have to see artificial intelligence as multi-layered. There is close to the user artificial intelligence that simply can make their life easier. Let me give you an example. Something like if you have a system where you have a lot of text data, for example, executive summaries, out of 100 or 1,000 measures that you're running through your organization. It's very difficult to aggregate an information out of text. If you're in the situation of not having technology support, it's basically you have to read 1,000 pages and then come up with your own conclusion. That's one example where artificial intelligence can help very easily with what is called text mining, which can show you what are the most noted aspects within those summaries. It can be very, very helpful to manage more complexity with less effort. There's also, of course, the long-term implication of if you collect strategic data, you can actually learn something on it that you wouldn't be otherwise. And last but not least, when it comes to methodology, I'm sure there are within this execution forum that talk about different methodologies, such as OKR, balanced scorecard is an older one, Hoshinkanri, etc. And those are all very valid approaches. They're very helpful to structuring certain things. But if you just choose a methodology and maybe a tool that supports it, that is also very limiting. Most of those are not really for strategy development. Sometimes they are for innovation management. They're more on the side of balanced and effective strategy execution. So any tool you select should be able to support whatever methodology is applied in your organization, but it shouldn't be limited to it. It should be able to work in a hybrid mode, with supporting different methodologies, and most of all, extending its scope beyond just the basic principle of, for example, an OKR, which is very effective in a certain range, but ineffective outside of that range. So it has to be extended towards, for example, initiatives, etc., to become truly effective. And if we look at the potential of technology, of course, technology is not the silver bullet. It will not, magically take all problems away. But it has a potential of significantly reducing the problems that we have today with managing the complexity. We believe that there's at least a 50% potential of reducing the strategic opportunity and execution gap, and even higher at creating transparency of how are we progressing, even while we're going forward, and do we have any issues that need to be escalated, that need to be solved on the way. Then Carsten and I both came out of consulting, so for a time being, we were the young consultants who had to do all the manual work of finding information, integrating it, aggregating it, visualizing it, etc. There's a huge potential here to take off a lot of that workload and make a lot of very creative and capable people just more effective by giving them more time to do the actual job instead of the manual work. And last but not least, having a central digital platform that collects all the strategy data unlocks the potential of actually learning something out of that data. And the last slide about us, we are the company Evolutionizer. The product that we are providing is called Solid. It's an enterprise cloud for strategy platform. And what distinguishes us is that we don't come out of the heritage purely of software development and looking at what somebody wants to do. We actually come out of the strategy world. We were strategy professionals, we are strategy professionals, and are building tools for exactly the application area that we ourselves have been working in for such a long time. The next thing is we are, in our approach, a full and true end-to-end approach. We don't see strategy execution as being a disconnected single entity. We believe that the whole transformation work from strategy development to execution to assumption controlling has to be all connected with each other. And the simplest way to do that is a single platform that supports it top down. And last but not least, we're born in the cloud, but we're also born on the most effective technology available that is highly accepted in enterprise environments, which is Microsoft Azure. which gives us a lot of leverage. We don't start with a core technology where we have to develop a lot of it ourselves. We, for example, live in the integrated world of Microsoft, so connections to other Microsoft and other applications is a lot easier, and the technology is extremely powerful, extremely available, and very accepted, in particular when it comes to data security and information security in enterprise environments. So my last offer is, if you want to know more, check out our website, call us, the contact information is in here, and we'll be happy to dive deeper into how we see strategy development and execution needs to be supported digitally. And with that, I'd like to open up to some questions. I believe we are well in time, so we have plenty of time to answer any questions.
Yeah, you are pretty in time. Thank you for that. There's a lot of applause coming in. Thanks, Carsten and Patrick. So opening up to the group, are there questions or comments you would like to make? Maybe while we're waiting for the questions, I would like to pose a first one, if you allow me. Sometimes you hear the argument when it's about tooling, strategy management. You hear, people using Excel and PowerPoint with the argument like, okay, we first need to get to a certain maturity level, and once we have reached that maturity level, after that we go to a professional tool. How would you react to that argument?
You could make the same argument at the time that we were introducing ERP systems, CRM systems, etc. Of course, it's an understandable argument, but you can also argue the other side and say a tool that's specialized for what you do will actually bring the maturity towards you. There is, of course, at the moment that you introduce something that brings with it a certain methodology and a certain maturity, there's going to be some learning curve. But it's a lot easier to guide it into that learning curve by a system that has a best practice approach than to try to develop the best practice yourself and then maybe even some version that's not as effective, asking for that to be digitally represented. It's the same as with to introduce an SAP system today. Your best approach is not to say this is the way we do things and now please SAP be customized to do exactly that, but to look very closely at what SAP actually brings, because they bring very good best practices for most use cases. And that's the more successful approach we find.
If I may add one thought also, I mean, as with SAP, you typically do not kind of implement the whole SAP suite in one thing. You start with FI or with a module in a division in a country, etc., and then you take it from there. And I think that's the charming thing around about Solib. I mean, you don't necessarily need to start day one, end-to-end strategy, all countries, all business units. You start in of the organization. You even may want to start with a complex initiative, with a complex program, where you take advantage of the PMO capabilities of Solib, and then you build it from there. But the nice and the charming thing is, I mean, it's basically a platform approach. So you do not end up having kind of 5 different databases for tracking productivity programs, and you have 25 different PowerPoint versions of strategy documents. So you kind of you start to build it, you build the user base over time, but you are in a one well thought through, consistent platform and with clearly end-to-end workflow capability.
Okay. Thank you for that.
And I believe there are some questions in the chat, yes, and I'd like to go through them in order. I believe the first question, what's a good starting point? Carsten actually already said, one of the typical starting points is to start in the program management office. So in execution on a top-down level. Another is sometimes if you have a complex strategy development process that captures a lot of information out of the organization, that's also a sweet spot to start in. So basically we have 4 different sub-products if somebody looks for an easier starting point. They are objectives management, program management, C-level reporting, and strategy development. Now, the next question I can see is, how does the tool tie into performance management? And that's a very good question, because performance management, we believe, was actually digitized earlier than most other things. Performance management, enterprise performance management is a good methodology that, if you look at end-to-end approach, is integrated into the end-to-end approach. So either through objectives or strategic plannings, you can do your performance management, you can break down performance goals for groups, for individuals, etc., and then measure the execution again. So it basically sucks up and integrates performance management and puts it into a broader context. Now, the next question I can see is about OKR. Now, OKR is very interesting as one of the methodologies. OKR, probably everybody knows, has been made popular first by Intel and then by Google. And if you look at where that grew, it actually grew in very, very dynamic industries, where you couldn't actually detail plans for the future because it was a maximum of volatility, a lot of opportunity, but you didn't know where it was. So it makes sense to use an approach such as OKR to say, well, what is our overall strategy? What do we want to achieve? And then to harden it a little bit, let's do some key results and do a structured approach for that. So my statement would be, the more dynamic a situation is, the more opportunity-driven it is, the better an OKR system can work. I can also tell you where it can't work. If you're in a hard restructuring situation, if you're close to insolvency, for example, and you have to turn around a company, then OKRs will not be very effective. That's where you need a top-down approach as where are our biggest levels of cost and revenue, and how do we very quickly turn those around. So it depends on your situation as a company and the industry that you're in. And some are a true sweet spot for OKR, where you don't need much more, and some it is not effective. Now, the next question I can see is scenario planning when it comes to strategy development. Actually, scenario planning is at the heart of strategy development. If you look at strategy development, you basically have an input, which is sources of ideas. And then you generate a pipeline of ideas and start hardening them, and etc. But in the end, you will not come to a conclusion of the best strategy unless you do modeling and scenario planning. And that is oftentimes done today already. That's where Excel comes into play, where you build for certain scenarios, you build models, and then you build assumptions and look how they play out. But with the current technology, you're limited to a certain set, and you're also limited in one guy builds one model and understands it. It's very hard for anybody else to dive into a model that somebody else built. With a centralized platform that has some standards of what is our KPI tree and what are scenarios, you can actually build more effective models that can also be communicated a lot more easily. Instead of a model where you either show the results and nobody else can understand the model, you can actually build very transparent models where everybody can play around with it. Well, my personal assumption is the world will change in a certain way, and what does that imply for my strategy? So it broadens, the technology can broaden the amount of modeling you can do and scenario planning you can do. And the last question I can see now is, does the tool feed into execution of the individual strategic initiatives? Actually, yes. It not only feeds in it, it manages it, if you like. I said before, there can be integration, or you can do it all in the platform itself. So it's built to also go down to the individual execution of individual initiatives, down to a measure where you capture everything that you're doing and see whether you're actually achieving your target. But if you use a different methodology of capturing your success of strategy execution, it can tie into it. For example, if you're applying a tool from one of the consulting firms for a certain part of your strategy and executing your measures in that, we can basically take the results out of that tool and represent them in our tool and then see the target achievement for that part of the execution in our tool.
I mean, the one thing, which I've seen so many times in my prior consulting life is this whole challenge that in operations you often have the kind of the budget and the forecasting world, and then you often separately have all of the initiative world. And then typically the initiative world then is also very decentral. I mean, you have one logic for initiatives in this business unit, in that country, in that geography, etc. So having an overview, I mean, how the initiatives really translate into the P&L. Having an overview whether the various initiatives are consistent, whether they in part are mutually exclusive, and you just can't add them up because it doesn't make sense. Yeah. So in the M&A initiative, you are planning to sell a part of the business, and in a productivity initiative, you plan to improve the productivity. So either or. Yeah, so having this kind of integrated platform, and then kind of slice it, dice it, simulate, play it, change transfer prices, change exchange rates. I mean, all of that where we used to spend hours and days and weeks then to do it manually, you basically can do that online in an interactive way if you're using this platform.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Carsten and Patrick. Also great. Thanks the audience for all the questions. We will have a 1 minute break, and then we come back with the last speaker before the lunch break. See you soon.